Okay, thank you very much. Well, it's a great pleasure to welcome Denis Alexander, who you've met already. I said one thing we had that was different between us was that he's a biological scientist, I'm a physical scientist. One thing we have in common is that we're both fellows of St Edmund's College, which is just up the road, and that's why the Faraday Institute is based in St Edmund's College. Denis was at Oxford for his undergraduate degree. In fact, he then did a PhD. I think he was supervised by Arthur Peacock, wasn't he?
He was my tutor at Oxford.
He was your tutor. Okay, so we were talking about Arthur Peacock in the last talk. Was Denis's tutor in Oxford. He then did a PhD, and he spent about 15 years working abroad in Muslim countries, latterly in Lebanon. So he has a lot of experience of those aspects of working in cultures with different religions as a dominant religion. But since then he came back to Britain, has been working on cancer basically and related things at the Babraham Institute, which is just outside Cambridge. He retired from that in January a year ago, although he's still got a 10%. He's still got a research group there, but he spends most of his time on the Faraday Institute now. So today he's going to talk, as you see, about whether evolution has any religious significance. So over to you, Denis.
So as you can see, we're now coming to one of these topics that's been mentioned quite a bit already. For some reason it seems to be the one where people often think, that science and religion interact or impact or whatever you want to say more than some of the other topics. Of course, it's not a new topic, as we were hearing last night and also this morning and in the life of Darwin and so forth. But what we're going to do now is to bring it into the contemporary era, as it were. So I suppose I ought to start by telling you, in fact, you already have guessed by what Bob said, that I'm an evolutionary biologist, not in the sense that I actually work on the theory of evolution, but rather Darwinian evolution gives the framework for all the biological research that I've ever done in my life over the past 38 years. And I suppose that's true really of most biologists. Most biologists don't actually work on evolution. They simply use it as the paradigm within which all biological research is carried out. And indeed it's that framework of Darwin and evolution that makes sense really of what we do in our laboratories every day. And I can't really put this any better than the late great evolutionary biologist Ernst Mayr, who said, and I quote, that the theory of evolution is quite rightly called the greatest unifying theory in biology. The diversity of organisms, similarities and differences between kinds of organisms, patterns of distribution and behavior, adaptation and interaction, all this was merely a bewildering chaos of facts until given meaning by the evolutionary theory. And I think that's exactly right, that Darwin brought coherence into an awful lot of data that was out there already, but needed somebody to come along and actually make sense of it all. The other sort of more personal thing that I want to say by way of introduction is I actually haven't ever thought in my life that that evolution has any particular religious significance. I mean, it clearly has some, as we'll be thinking about, but just to illustrate that, I was a student, as Bob was saying, in fact with Arthur Peacock, back a few years ago now, in the Oxford of the mid-1960s. I was also a Christian at the time. I was quite engaged, I suppose, with different church activities and so forth. I also regularly attended the Humanist Society at the time, which was at that point the largest society in the university, and which was quite a sort of secular society, and I always enjoyed engaging with secular thought as well. But I can't remember at any time anyone really raising the issue of evolution as perhaps we do now, as particularly a flashpoint for the relationship between science and religion. I don't remember any lectures like the one we're having today. I don't remember people giving sermons about it. And I don't remember atheists particularly getting excited about it, nor Christians either for that matter. And so it was simply, as far as I remember, a non-issue. I'd never knowingly met a creationist in my life. Intelligent design was still, I suppose, a quarter of a century away. So I'm just reflecting on the fact that during the past quarter of a century, something's changed. I think we'd be aware of that by simply reading our papers. And I suppose one question we can be asking ourselves as we go along, what is it that's changed? Was it that actually we were wrong back in the 1960s, thinking there was this very happy relationship between Christian theology in this case and Darwinian evolution? Or have there been various political changes, religious changes, or so forth in intervening years? And I suppose that is a topic for discussion we can keep in the back of our minds as we think about this question this afternoon. Now I want to spend briefly a little bit of time on answering the questions from two perspectives: sociological perspective, does evolution have any religious significance? A little bit on the history. We've looked at the history quite a bit. I just want to touch on that, and then I'm going to spend the bulk of my time really getting into the biology of contemporary Darwinian thought and thinking about whether that has any particular kind of religious significance. Now, clearly, there are people who think that sociologically, from a sociological point of view, an answer to that question that we had before us, the answer is clearly yes. Dawkins, of course, is famous for saying that he was only able to adopt atheism, or people can only adopt atheism, in a logically tenable way by being Darwinians, and it's that way that you can become an intellectually fulfilled atheist. This sort of breed, I would say, of evolutionary biologists who believe that they want to invest evolution with kind of strong atheistic overtones is again something I think not totally new, but particularly recent. And I have to say that I don't remember anyone particularly in that category as I think back into the 60s. Maybe I just didn't know about them. But if you think about the opposite end of the spectrum, from Richard Dawkins, you had people like the canonical creationist, the late Henry Morris, who died, I think, a few months ago. And he said this back in 1980, but can't we be Christian evolutionists, they say? Yes, no doubt it is possible to be a Christian and an evolutionist. Likewise, one can be a Christian thief, a Christian adulterer, or a Christian liar. Christians can be inconsistent and illogical about many things, but that doesn't make them right. Now, I quite like creationist statement. They're very clear. There's no being about the You know exactly, where you are. But I think what's interesting, the reason I flag those two comments up, one from a keen atheist and one from, as it were, the opposite end of the pole, is they clearly share a common understanding of evolution, in the sense that it's something that goes well beyond science. It goes well beyond a theory simply to explain the origins of biological diversity. And they obviously both feel, both the atheists and the creationists both feel, that there are other things at stake here, that evolution has things to tell us about moral issues and all kinds of other things as well. And I think both those comments, in a way, give quite a nice illustration of the way in which the grand theories of science, in particular, so often in the history of science, have become invested with all kinds of ideological overtones and investments. And it's a fairly typical process, I think. You start out by having scientific theory X, whether it's evolution or Big Bang cosmology, whatever it might be, and then gradually, for various social cultural reasons, people begin to invest their own ideology into that particular theory, until eventually, when it comes to the public understanding, then the scientific theory X becomes equated with ideological meaning Y. And I think that's very much happened if you look at the history of evolution. One of the books I'd recommend on that, by the way, is by Peter Bowker, Reconciling Science and Religion. It's about the history of science and religion in the first half of the 20th century, and quite an interesting discussion there about what happened with the handling of Darwinian evolution over that period. But when you just think about some of the ideological abuses of Darwinism, I mean, the extraordinary wide range of different political and ideological entities that people have tried using Darwinism to support capitalism, tried in the use of supporting communism, racism, almost every ism you can think about has been used. Darwinism has been used to try and support it, and of course, very tragically and sadly came into the thinking of Mein Kampf, Nazi thinking and so forth, and was even used to justify that terrible final solution of the Second World War. And so you get evolution used in this huge number of different ways. And so that's something just to reflect on as we think about public attitudes towards evolution and how people think about it. I have to say that I want to address it particularly this afternoon as a biological theory and not as any kind of ideology, and I think that will become clear as we go along. But I think it also should make us rather cautious as we think about lots of polls, in the States and now also in this country as well. There are a number of polls about how many people do or don't believe in evolution, all this kind of thing, and it comes out in the newspapers and so forth. And this poll was carried out, or was published about a year ago now. It's a BBC Horizon poll carried out by Maury based on 2,000 UK respondents. And the response to that poll was quite surprising to me, as I think to a number of people, because it appears to say that the anti-Darwinian view affects about 39% of the UK population, which is actually not far behind the USA percentage, which has been steady at 42% for a very long time now. But I actually talked to a researcher on this Horizon program, and to try and find out what actual questions have been put to people in this poll. You always need to find out in questionnaires, what were the actual questions that people asked. And it turns out, in fact, there was no question for people who believe both in God and in evolution. So already the questions were forcing people to make a kind of decision, as if these two spheres were quite incompatible. And so obviously that leaves out probably a huge proportion of the population, I would be one of them, who happen to believe in God and happen to be very happy with evolution. And so I think one has to be rather cautious about some of these polls, which are often, as we were thinking with John Polkinghorne this morning, are used in order to generate a story which journalists can then write about and so on. Now, I'm not saying there isn't an anti-Darwinian movement in this country, but I would be very, very surprised if it's as high actually as 39%, and I think probably that was just a reflection of the questions asked. But when you come, as I say, to the United States, 42%, 44% of the population very consistently say that they disbelieve in the Darwinian theory of evolution, and that level has been pretty steady now for several decades. It doesn't seem to be going up, or neither up nor down. And that is, of course, the country which currently leads the world in science and technology. And so that's an interesting thing to reflect on. So if we want to ask the question sociologically, does evolution have any religious significance in the public consciousness? Absolutely yes. There's no doubt about that at all, that we have to answer yes for that, for whatever reasons, and there may be quite complex reasons. Now historically, we've already spent some time on this, and I'm going to go through this very briefly indeed. I'm very happy that John Brooke has set for us such a wonderful background to the whole introduction to the origin of species and so forth. And John was reminding us about the way in which the origin of species, 1859, was given birth to in this context where natural theology was still extremely popular in this country and hadn't yet lost its force and its interest and so forth. And one of the interesting things to reflect is a sort of study you can do now on your PC, is to get the text down from the web. And it turns out actually that in the origin of species, at least I think it's the first edition, I can't quite remember, but the word creation or creator or create is actually mentioned 104 times. Now if you look for the word evolution in the origin of species, you hardly find it. There are just 2 mentions on the last page. Not quite fair comparison, because the word wasn't used by Darwin for technical reasons. It actually meant something rather different at the time of Darwin. It meant more what we would call embryological development. And so Darwin was much more fond of speaking about descent with modification. But clearly, as John was reminding us, born into a culture and a time when natural theology was very prominent, and John also reminded us of the huge diversity in responses to Darwinism, and I think that's extremely important to just perhaps review a little bit. There were scientists, both religious and secular, who rapidly incorporated the theory into their scientific worldview. They didn't make much fuss about it. There were quite a number of scientists who opposed the theory on scientific grounds alone, and I think we have to remember that it was a much weaker theory, really, at the time of the origin of species, simply because, there were no genes in those days, not that Darwin knew about, and so it lacked all kinds of things now that give the whole theory a much more coherence than it had in 1859. There were scientific popularizers and clerics who readily accepted Darwin's theory. They very quickly sort of baptized it into natural theology. And there were some clerics, a minority I think actually as it happens, who were quite opposed to Darwinism and so on. And so really to do justice to all that, you simply have to spend hours in looking at that fascinating diversity, and we've been thinking about that a little bit. And John also quoted from Aubrey Moore, who actually was the director of the Oxford Botanical Gardens. It was the oldest botanical gardens in the United Kingdom. He was a fellow at St John's College, and as John was telling us, Moore felt that Darwin had done the church a huge favour by, as it were, undermining this very deistic and distant God who occasionally came to interfere with the created order, and said that Darwinism appeared and under the guise of a foe did the work of a friend. And I think this other phrase, this quotation from what I'd like to read, because it's quite significant, I think, as we're thinking about the theology of this. Moore said there are not and cannot be any divine interpositions, he means by that interferences in nature, for God cannot interfere with himself. Quite an interesting thought. His creative activity is present everywhere. There is no division of labour between God and nature or God and law. For the Christian theologian, the facts of nature are the acts of God. And I think that's something we will want to be returning to later on as well, and in a sense quite relevant to the whole discussion about intelligent design, which I want to get to right at the end of this talk. So you have these clerics, and you of course had Charles Kingsley here in Cambridge, who was Professor of Literature, also very involved in sort of early socialist movements in this country and so forth, who was very sympathetic to Darwin. I had the great joy of holding in my hands the original letter, in gloved hands I have to say, from Charles Kingsley, written to Darwin very soon after the publication of The Origin of Species, which is here in the collection of letters, saying what a wonderful contribution this was, and how actually Kingsley said I'd always thought that way anyway, but typical Cambridge person, has to say. But Jim Moore has been mentioned already several times, who lives just down the road here, now professor at the Open University, mentions that with but few exceptions, the leading Christian thinkers in Great Britain came to terms quite readily with Darwinism and evolution. And American, not really sociologist there, it's not quite correct, Israeli historian George Marsden said, with the exception of Harvard's Louis Agassiz that John was mentioning to us, virtually every American Protestant zoologist and botanist accepted some form of evolution by the early 1870s. And I think it's quite interesting to reflect on the fact that actually Darwinian evolution was popularized to a large degree in North America by Orthodox Christian people. And Asa Gray has already been mentioned, who actually helped get The Origin of Species published in North America. And I always like telling that to my American friends, because of course the situation is so different today. And it's worth underlining the fact, when we're thinking about creationism, that certainly young Earth creationism, the belief that the Earth was only made in 6 days with all its biological diversity about 10,000 years ago. I mean, this is a fairly recent phenomenon. This is not what people believe, certainly not what academics believed in the 19th century. There simply weren't academics at the time when Darwin was writing, for example, who thought that the Earth was very young. They all knew by the early 19th century that the Earth was very old. Now, there was great discussion about how old that might be, but nobody was in really any doubt that the Earth was very old indeed. And so the whole history of creationism, which we don't have time to go into now, is a fascinating history, and it's related to all kinds of interesting things like the First World War itself, I think, to a large degree. But if you're interested in that, I would recommend the book The Creationists by Ronald Numbers, which has now come out in a huge, fat, new edition in 2006, and it really gives the whole history of creationism and really the cultural, political and sociological wells, which sort of drove that whole thing, where it came from. And it's a fascinating story. If you want a very brief version, you can read that also in my book, Rebuilding the Matrix. Okay, so that's just by way of introduction. So, in the historical terms, does evolution have religious significance? Historically, clearly yes. There's a huge history of it, with all kinds of social, ideological, and other implications. Let's come to now Darwinism as a biological theory for the explanation of biological diversity. Now, does that have any religious implications? Clearly, as you'll understand, it's a different theory now from what it was in Darwin's time. It's been united with genetics to give the so-called neo-Darwinian synthesis, and the two key people actually who did that were J.B.S. Haldane, who later became a Marxist here in Cambridge, and the statistician whose name I just blanked on, and somebody's going to help me with.
R.A. Fisher.
Sorry, R.A. Fisher. Yeah, I just blanked on R.A. Fisher's name, who was here in the Department of Pathology, who was actually an Anglican, and I think it's a wonderful combination where you have an Anglican and a Marxist who are actually putting together, you know, the neo-Darwinian synthesis of the 1920s and 1930s. Now, I think it's important that we spend a little time just thinking about biological evolution. And I apologize to the biologists here, but sometimes you can have a whole discussion about evolution and really people have all kinds of ideas in their heads about what we're talking about. So I'm going to spend the next 5 minutes just talking basic biology. So if you're a biologist, this is your time for a little snooze. Do wake up though, please, in 5 minutes' time. But let's just think a bit about what evolution is about. This is the Reader's Digest version. Biology for you was a very long time ago, and so we're just going to give a little summary. What does evolution mean? Well, evolution is a process that results in heritable changes in a population which is spread over many generations. And as we know, heritable changes occur by means of genes. And so when we talk about the gene pool, in biology we mean that set of genes in a species or a population. That's the complete gene pool, which is interbreeding, so it's constantly changing, it's on the move, it's actually in process. But when modern biologists say that they've observed evolution, what they mean is that they've detected a change in the frequency of genes in a population. That would be a gene's eye view of evolution. And so we can summarize the process of evolution very succinctly here. Genes mutate, individuals are selected, and populations evolve. And so for evolution to occur, clearly you've got to have mechanisms to increase genetic variation, and you've got to have mechanisms to decrease it. And we've got a lot of mechanisms there will increase genetic variation. They include mutations, they include gene duplication. We now understand that gene duplication has been a very important driver in the evolutionary process. We have gene flow, that means new genes coming in from other breeding populations, and so forth. And we have recombination. We have that changeover or swapping over of genes during the process of meiosis, reductive cell division, where you have the generation of the sperm and the eggs. And very importantly, you have variation coming in through the regulatory genes that regulate the program of which genes are switched on and switched off, and in what order. And I think it's now pretty well understood that of all the various forces driving evolution from a genetic point of view, it's probably the control genes, the regulatory genes, that play a very central part. So those are all processes for increasing genetic variation. And then there's one great filter that, of course, is a very conservative process. It's a process for decreasing genetic variation, and that's the one that Darwin discovered, the process of natural selection. And so each set of genes within an individual organism is tested out by how successful that individual is in passing on its particular class of genetic variants to succeeding generations. And that's a process known as reproductive success. And so evolution is really two theories back to back. There's two things operating together. You've got two devices. You've got a device that introduces random variation into the system, and you've got a device to test out which variation works best. And so in one sense, evolution is like a giant sort of workshop for testing out genomes. Which are the genomes that actually work best in a planet with these particular ecological niches, and what's going to flourish in that particular ecological niche. And of course, something that flourishes in one will not flourish in another. Now, what about speciation? Well, species the concept is fairly simple in contemporary biology. It's a species, it consists of a group of populations which do not normally breed with other such groups. And that's thought to occur either by allopatric mechanisms, which happen when a population, as shown here, splits into two or more subdivisions which are separated for a very long time. They genetically evolve, and so if they ever get back, if species B and species C get back together again, say 1 million years later, or however long it is, they will be unable to breed together. And this is probably the major mechanism of speciation, although there are some cases also of what's called sympatric speciation, where you get populations, separate populations, evolving out even when they're in the same sort of geographical area and becoming isolated for various reasons. And actually speciation can be relatively rapid during especially adaptive radiation, when you have founder animals which then have a new whole series of ecological niches to expand into. And there are some classic examples of that happening. Lake Victoria in Africa happens to be one of them, which has actually dried out several times during the course of its history. The last time was 14,700 years ago, and it's thought that genetically it looks as if there were 2 species of cichlid fish which actually seeded, as it were, the waters of Lake Victoria at that time, came downstream from another lake. As little as a few decades ago, people could still detect 170 species, separate species of cichlid that wouldn't interbreed with each other over that period of time. And so actually speciation under particular circumstances can be quite a rapid process. Now, in animals, generally speciation occurs by simply genetic diversity increasing to the point at which interbreeding can no longer occur. Plants have special ways of doing it, which actually can be quite sudden. This is a recent example from a particular plant which was introduced into North America. The history of the introduction is well known, so it's been possible to track what's gone on. It's called Tragopogon. It's actually, apparently you can eat it as a vegetable. I've never eaten it myself, but that's what people tell me. It's also called salsify, so perhaps not a very well-known vegetable for us. But the point here is that you have 2 species of Tragopogon, each of which have 6 chromosome pairs, and they hybridize. And usually, when you get hybridization, then you have sterile outputs. But in this particular case, there's a Tragopogon marus, which was discovered, which is a new species of Tragopogon, which has 12 chromosome pairs. In other words, it's a classic example of where doubling the chromosome number has actually generated a new species. And what happens is that instead of getting a sterile hybrid, you get a reproductively fruitful hybrid, which can actually reproduce and fertilize and so forth, but it's doubled its number of chromosomes. So this is a rather striking example of speciation at work. So when people say, can you observe speciation, the answer is yes, you can, rarely, but in plants it's much easier. And just this past year, in fact, it's been shown with a couple of butterfly species that you can get 2 new species formed in butterflies by, again, the process of chromosomal doubling. Now, if you look at dogs, for example, you see this huge array of different morphologies, of different structures, and you might be, as we've been thinking from John Brooks' talk, if you look at certain things, you'd say, well, how can they possibly be members of the same species? But in fact, you know, they are. They have 39 chromosome pairs. In this case, they'll have the same number of chromosome pairs, and in principle, not always in practice, they can reproduce. They are all part of the same species. So let's not think of speciation as necessarily introducing very major changes in morphology, the way we would just look at an animal or a plant, whatever it is. They can be very, very similar. And of course, now and again, evolutionary biologists strike lucky. In fact, this was a result of this discovery, which came out last year, the tiktaalik, an intermediate between fish and land-living animals, was actually discovered by a group who went up to the northern part of Canada, had a very cold expedition up there, I think, but went with a specific aim of looking for, they knew roughly where to look, for looking for intermediates between fish and the tetrapods or land-living animals. And they had this great delight, after a lot of looking, of finding the tiktaalik, which is a classic example, which has scales like a fish, but it also has 4 little legs with elbows. It's like a fish that can do press-ups, somebody has said, and is a classic example of an intermediate between 2 different kinds of animal. Okay, so we could go on about that, and my aim is really not to give you a whole lecture on evolution, but simply that's the sort of background we're thinking of when we're thinking about what is the best explanation for all this biological diversity that we see around us. and the best explanation, certainly to me, is Darwinian evolution. And I think it's very remarkable. I have to say this. I mean, a lot of scientific theories don't last very long. And Darwinian evolution has really had a good innings. It doesn't mean to say it'll last forever, but it does mean it's really carried on being a good map. We were thinking about theories being good maps to find our way around the data. And evolution is a great map, to give coherence. And even in the sequencing of human genomes, now we have 300 sequences, maybe more, of different species, complete sequences now completed, many of them not yet in the public domain. But that is such a good example where those sequences fit so beautifully on the Darwinian map. And that's a sign of a good theory, that it carries on making sense of the data. So, let's come back now to our basic question. Does all this evolutionary biology have any particular religious significance? And my suggestion is that if you just start by simply looking at the biology itself, then you can pretty much fit it into any kind of metaphysical system that you like, with more or less degree of consistency. Now, what do I mean by that? Well, what I mean is that I would suggest that actually everybody comes to their science and they interpret it within an overarching metaphysical framework, which might be atheism, it might be agnosticism, it might be some kind of religious faith. And as we've already been thinking this morning, these are philosophical, metaphysical, religious beliefs that go well beyond science. And so naturally what people tend to do is to interpret what they see in their science, for example, within the matrix provided by their particular worldview. Now, I don't want to take any of the thunder again away from Alistair McGrath later on this afternoon, but one cannot resist this quote from Richard Dawkins, who says, as we look at the universe we observe had precisely the properties we should expect if there is at bottom no design, no purpose, no evil and no good, nothing but blind indifference. But I would want to say, how could it be otherwise if you start out with a very convinced position, as Dawkins obviously does, that of metaphysical atheism. I see atheism as metaphysical in its implications as any faith or whatever it might be. I would say it's simply the conclusions are built into that starting presupposition. If you believe there's no ultimate reality, no ultimate purpose in the universe, then clearly, as you look around evolution, that's what you're going to see. It's sort of already enclosed within that overarching metaphysical framework. But on the other end of the spectrum, as it were, we've already seen that actually evolution was rapidly accepted by the vast majority of scientists with Christian commitments and other religious commitments within a very short time after the publication of Darwin's theory. It was simply baptized into a Christian worldview. Now, how could that be? How could that be? We sort of illustrated it here. Evolutionary biology located within this overarching Christian matrix or worldview. Now, I think to really understand that, we need to reflect a little bit more on the kind of Christian doctrine of creation that people like Aubrey Moore had, that we just were talking about, and people like Charles Kingsley and so forth. And I think they had certain theological resources that enabled them to place evolution, if not without problems at all, but without too many problems within their theological framework. And obviously that's something we could spend a long time on. But let's just bring out the two really key strands in the Christian doctrine of creation that, for example, would have been very familiar to someone like Aubrey Moore. First of all, clearly in the traditional Christian theology, God is transcendent in relationship to his created order. That means God is distinct from his creation, an idea that we find throughout the biblical text. And so in this worldview, the created order is contingent upon God's creative actions and purposes, as again we were thinking about this morning. In other words, we can't really second guess God. We can't rationalize really from first principles, as it were, the kind of world that God should have created, or the kind of processes that he should have used in doing it. We then, as scientists, can only describe what God has actually done to the best of our ability. And it has been argued, and I think John just briefly mentioned that in passing, that some historians of science have thought that the idea of the contingency of God's creation contributed to the growth of empiricism. In other words, if you believe and a God who can, as it were, do what he likes, is transcendent, is all-powerful over the whole created order, then that drives empiricism, because you cannot work out what that might be from first principles. You've actually got to go and do experiments to find out what that might be. And so you have somebody like Augustine, who I thought was on the slides, but who isn't, but saying things like, God, nature, basically it's God is what nature is, or God does what nature shows to us. It's a quotation like that. In other words, as you're looking out at nature, this is what God does, and all we as scientists now can do is to describe what that is. Now, the other main strand, of course, that you find very much, again, in the biblical texts and in church history and theology, is this whole idea of God's immanence in creation. And that's particularly the side, I think, that Aubrey Moore was keen on picking up. All that exists only continues to do so because of God's creative activities and this idea. So the properties of matter continue to be what they are because God wills that they should continue to have such properties. And here I've just put up a few examples from the Psalms, where you find very much from Hebrew thought this sense of God's continual action, making the grass grow, the lions roaring for their prey, seeking their food from God, and even involved in animal life and death and so forth. A very, very strong sense you find in these great Old Testament passages about God's actions, his continual actions in the created order. And you find a similar balance, if you like, between the transcendence of God and the immanence of God, very much in the Islamic doctrine of creation. I've just put here some examples from verses from the Quran, and Mehdi Gushani has a nice book which you might want to look at, where he has a chapter particularly on the doctrine of creation in Islam. But you have verses such as this one: the originator, God is the originator of heaven and earth, and whenever he decrees something, he says to it, be, and it is. God is the creator of everything, and he is in charge of everything. Mankind, it is he who stand in need of God, and he is the all-sufficient, the praiseworthy, and so forth. So you find these twin aspects of the transcendence and the immanence of God, and perhaps particularly in Sufi theology is a very powerful sense of God's immanence in the created order, perhaps particularly brought out in that tradition. Now, how comfortably that's the quote I was looking for, how comfortably can we now today absorb evolution within that kind of theistic framework? Now, I would suggest pretty well. I mean, arguably, the evolutionary narrative is at least consistent with a God who has intentions and purposes for the created order. That's a history with a time flow culminating with the appearance of personhood. And John Oggingham was reminding us this morning of how, in a sense, deeply amazing and mysterious this appearance of personhood is when you think about the very long history of the universe in which we live. And so the novelty and creativity of the evolutionary process, I would suggest, is likewise consistent with a God who delights in his creation as an artist delights in her handiwork, or perhaps a musician, composer delights in his or her compositions. Now, of course, biologists in their professions tend to disapprove of notions of progress in general scientific discourse, and no doubt for the best of reasons. But I think if you stand back, any biologist who stands back and looks at the process as a whole, then the impression of progress is actually inescapable and arouses our raw wonder. Now, here's, for example, a rather well-known evolutionary biologist, Sean Carroll, who's hugely prolific at the moment in the scientific literature in evolutionary developmental biology. And this is a quote from a recent review, in fact, in Nature, where Sean says this, and I quote, "Life's contingent history," notice that, life's contingent history, "could be viewed as an argument against any direction or pattern in the course of evolution or the shape of life. But it's obvious that larger and more complex life forms have evolved from simple unicellular ancestors, and that various innovations were necessary for the evolution of new means of living." And so Carroll, I think, is choosing his words carefully here. But if pressed, every biologist has to admit that multicellular organisms are more complex than bacteria, and that mammals are, in a sense, more advanced than yeast, that the human brain has more capacities than that of a shrew, whatever it might be. I hope that's the case. So I think it's perverse, simply perverse, to deny some kind of arrow in the direction of biological time. Now, there are two problems that people often raise in response to a theistic interpretation of the evolutionary process, and I'm sure there are others as well that will come up in the question time, and I will leave those to question. But I just want to tackle two of the particular problems that are often raised. I think the first question is fairly easy to answer, actually, and the second one is really quite hard, so we'll leave that to the one afterwards. But the first question arises from the notion that evolution is a chance process, and that somehow this is incompatible with a creator God who has intentions and purposes for the creative process. Well, I would suggest this is based simply on a misunderstanding, because if you take evolution as a whole, as we've just been thinking, it's very far from being a chance process. In reality, it's a tightly regulated process that has, to some degree at least, predictable outcomes. And this is where I find myself singing very much, in fact, in this case, from the same song sheet, as it were, as Richard Dawkins, very much in agreement. For example, in the preface to his book, The Blind Watchmaker, Richard points out one of my tasks will be to destroy this eagerly believed myth that Darwinism is a theory of chance. And he again repeats that in a number of his writings. And of course, the reason for insisting on that is quite simple. We've already reflected on the fact that all genomes, although the variation in the genome is generated by random mutation, happily so, otherwise all of us in this room would be a clone. I think we would prefer not to be a clone. And so we do have variation, but all of that is tested out by this huge sieve, this huge testing process of natural selection. So at the end of the day, every phenotype is tested by this process, or the criterion rather, of reproductive success. And so that explains this striking phenomenon of convergence that John Brooke has already drawn our attention to, and which has been highlighted by Simon Conway Morris, already mentioned here in Cambridge, whose book is at the back, and if you're interested in the whole question of convergence and evolution, do look at that book. For example, the convergence of mimicry of insects and spiders to an anthropomorphology has evolved independently at least 70 times. The eye is the other classic example. If you take compound and camera eyes together, they've evolved more than 20 times during the course of evolution. In other words, in independent lineages, you keep coming back to the same theme again and again. If you live in a planet of life, of light and darkness, then you need eyes. So eyes are what you're going to get. That's the sort of take-home message. And we've already reflected on the fact that the late Stephen Jay Gould was very fond of emphasizing contingency, the chance side of evolution and so forth. And Gould is famous for saying, if you replay the tape of life again, then you will come up with something quite different. And actually what Simon Conway Morris is trying to say, well, actually, it's the opposite. If you replay the tape of life again, then you're rather likely to come up with something that looks rather similar. Simon remarks, and I quote from his book at the back there, life has a peculiar propensity to navigate to rather precise solutions in response to adaptive challenges. On any other suitable planet, there will, I suggest, be animals very like mammals, and mammals much like apes, not identical, but similar, perhaps surprisingly similar. There's been a lot of interesting work recently also on protein structures, for example. Here's just one example from Science from last year. Darwinian evolution can follow only very few mutational paths to fitter proteins. And just to draw your attention to these words, circles here in the abstract from that paper, where the authors say we conclude that much protein evolution will be similarly constrained. This implies that the protein tape of life may be largely reproducible and even predictable. And this is simply coming about because we now know much more about protein evolution, genes that encode proteins, and the way in which they're highly restricted, in fact, in the number of motifs, the number of folds in a protein that will actually have possible functions in the biological world. And so yes, we can see the rolling of the dice, if you like, generating a wonderful array of diversity, but at the same time channeled down through a very limited array of genomes. And what I've done here on this slide is to picture every possible genome that you might imagine. Remember, we have in our own bodies about 25,000 genes. So if you randomize those, think about every possible genome you could have. They're the red boxes. And the ones that are actually selected there, the ones that will actually generate useful organisms, organisms that will flourish in particular ecological niches, are actually very, very limited. And it's as if you're tracking down the green boxes here. These are the only genomes that will actually work in the evolutionary lineage to give you a frog. And that's why you find this whole, it's an illustration really of the whole process of convergence. Now, the other major problem, I would say then, the problem of chance isn't really, it's a pseudo problem. I don't think it really is an accurate description of evolution taken as a whole. The second problem, which is often raised, is a much more profound question. And it arises, of course, from the fact, first of all, we know that all cells, for example, that have a nucleus can commit suicide. They can undergo what we call apoptosis, programmed cell death. And that's a really important mechanism in developmental biology and development of the brain and so forth, in renewing the cells of our bodies. But it's a reminder that in cells, as in the rest of biology, death is intrinsic to life. You cannot actually have one without another. And of course, every now and again, something goes wrong, and you get cancer, you get a genetic disease. That is part of the package that you have if you have this kind of life based on carbon-based life. We also know, of course, that more than 99% of the species that have ever lived have gone extinct. They went extinct millions of years ago. We never saw them. We also know that all living things exist in these complex food chains whereby the energy from the sun, or maybe from volcanic vents, wherever it might be, they're channeled along the food chains by a complex process of life and death. So death is intrinsic to carbon-based life. It's the only life, of course, that we know about. Obviously, all carnivores are designed to feed upon each other, designed in such a way that they can defend themselves. Now, of course, this raises the whole question of pain and death in the created order. And I'm not naive enough to think we're possibly going to solve that problem in the next few minutes, because I also want to leave a few minutes for intelligent design at the end, hopefully. But it does raise a question that goes back thousands of years before Darwin. Excuse me. So all I want to do now is to summarize a very few points that are from my own Christian perspective, because it's generally this kind of question that's raised in the context if you believe in a God who is actually good, who's morally good. If you have a God who's like that, who's morally good, then how can such a good God allow so much pain and suffering? So just 4 points to reflect on as we think about that, and you may want to come back to it in the discussion time. Clearly, pain is, as we say, an essential property of biological life, especially as nervous systems become more developed. All organisms, even single-cell organisms like bacteria or yeast, have ways, obviously, of detecting their environment. I like to say that all organisms are actually critical realists. In a sense, even a bacteria is a critical realist. It's sensing its environment, it's interpreting it all the time, it sometimes makes mistakes. Well, I guess that's critical realism in a sense. But the point is that with higher organisms, the awareness of pain increases as a consequence of our increased complexity of our nervous systems and of brain complexity. So brain complexity, awareness of the environment, experience of pain, all appear to increase in parallel. And so possessors of consciousness are uniquely aware of the joys of sex, of good food, of a beautiful sunset, enjoyable evenings at the theatre, but by the same token can be acutely aware of pain when it happens. Now clearly pain for all of us, as for all living organisms with these developed nervous systems, is essential for survival. And of course that leads on to the question, do we need so much pain for survival? The biological answer, although it's not watertight, but probably the answer is yes. Our nervous system has been shaped by millions of years of evolution to generate precisely the types of pain which will be most likely to ensure our survival. And so the mammals whose nervous systems worked inefficiently and they failed to pass on urgent action messages back to the brain, these are the animals that became extinct. They failed to pass their genes on to us. And so the pain levels that we experience, however much we might dislike the idea, they played a critical role in our evolutionary past and continue to be essential for ensuring our survival in the present. If you think about it, without pain, we would be walking around on broken legs, happily going to school with meningitis, crunching on broken glass in our Mars, but I shouldn't say this online, but there we go, I said it. But in other words, our lives would be considerably shorter than they are at the present. So pain is a practical good, which of course does not mean and does not imply that we should not be involved in helping to resolve the pain of humans as well as animals. Secondly, as we've just been thinking, death is a normal and inevitable aspect of biological life. It's a package deal. If you think about it, if there was no death, we would be in a static order. We would be like the waxwork humans, quote unquote, at Madame Tussauds in London, where you have a static universe with no change. If you want process, if you want change, if you want moving on, you need death and life. They are actually integral to the process. That's why I say this is a package deal that we're living in. No multicellular animal can live by deriving all its energy needs from chemical elements. They're all completely dependent on the food chain whereby organic molecules synthesized and other organisms are passed on to them. Thirdly, within the Christian worldview, God is faithful in rendering the properties of matter consistent and reproducible, otherwise science would be impossible. That's what we mean by the package deal. This is part of the consistency of God, and we would have no science if that wasn't the case. If we couldn't reproduce experiments, where would we be? That's the fact of reproducibility of the properties of matter that allow us to do science in the first place. And lastly, and very briefly, in the Christian worldview, this of course is not the end, but we're looking forward to a new heavens and a new earth, and so there's an eschatological aspect to thinking about this whole problem. And many people would reflect on the fact that therefore God, if you like, has created a tough world in which moral and spiritual growth is facilitated, which in a very deep sense is a preparation for this new heaven and a new earth where there will be no more pain or suffering, where ultimately the whole of the created order, in fact, will be redeemed and its best aspects will be brought into the fulfilled kingdom of God. Now that's a more specifically Christian reflection there in point number 4. So I'm absolutely not naive enough to think that that in itself is any kind of final answer to the question we've just posed, but I think those are 4 points that at least need careful reflection as we think about that particular question. So to summarize that point then, what I'm saying is, in the answer to the question, does biological evolution have any religious significance? My suggestion is that actually it can be placed within multiple metaphysical frameworks which have greater or lesser degrees of consistency. So in that sense, the theory really doesn't have any particular religious significance. And I think all attempts to use the theory to prop up personal ideologies really represent an abuse of science and sort of lay a burden on the scientific theory that it cannot possibly bear. It's simply a theory to explain the origins of biological diversity, and that's it. But then we can go on to ask the further question as to whether evolution sits more comfortably within theism in comparison with other metaphysical systems. And I would suggest that it does, and in the handout I've even suggested the possible terminology of evolutionary design for that. For example, evolution does display progress towards increased complexity. As conscious observers, products of the evolutionary process, we are the most complex entities known in the universe, and that's a fact that demands some kind of explanation. We've thought about convergence, the filling up of design space, and also that genomes, protein structures, and other biological systems are constrained to a very limited repertoire out of very large potential numbers. And so in this sort of interplay between chance and necessity, necessity clearly has the upper hand. Now, I'm going to look at the chairman at this point, because I could go on and talk a little bit about intelligent design, or I could stop there. I've been coughing and spluttering a bit. See, I just had flu before Christmas, and I'm still pulling out of it, so I occasionally splutter. I apologise. I'm not infectious. I'm an immunologist. I can assure you I'm not infectious, but I still am getting through that. Now, we could spend a few more minutes on intelligent design, if you're interested, or we could just throw it open enough questions. And I just want to, we do this by democracy here. We're very democratic in these Faraday courses. So just show a hand. If you would like a few more minutes on intelligent design, raise your hand. Okay, we're going to do intelligent design. That solved that question and gave the chairman an easy task. Okay, I want to spend a few minutes then, because partly it's been so much in the public domain, particularly in the States, and a little bit spilled over into other countries and so forth. Okay, so clearly, intelligent design, and here's a little summary about it, in case you're not familiar with what it's about. It's an anti-Darwinian movement, I think we have to call it that, and I want to use the term intelligent design as used by the writers and thinkers in this particular movement, okay? Because I think that's the fair way of doing it. Now, some people have tried to take that language and say, what they're really talking about is the anthropic principle. No, it's not. Okay, I think we have to be fair to people when they're actually telling us what their terminology applies to. And so I want to use the terminology of intelligent design specifically for this particular movement in the States, which has its own institute called the Discovery Institute, based in Seattle. It has fellows and so forth. So it has an institutional entity. It began, therefore, as an anti-Darwinian movement, particularly in the early 1990s. It was pioneered in a way by Philip Johnson and so forth. And it makes really three main claims. First of all, it claims that science in general, and evolution in particular, are infused with a philosophy of naturalism. We'll come back to naturalism. But since naturalism is anti-God, therefore Darwinian evolution should be attacked. That's point one. Secondly, there are biological entities, such as the bacterial flagellum, that are so-called irreducibly complex, meaning that they only function if all the components are present at the same time. And that's clearly the case in something like a bacterial flagellum, which has about 30 different proteins. And so, since Darwinian evolution requires small incremental changes, therefore such entities could not have evolved. That's the claim that ID folk would like to make. And so these irreducibly complex entities are explained by what they call a design inference, inference to design. Once you've identified those particular entities, you can conclude by long mathematical formulae as well that such entities in nature display design. And the third, very important, claim that ID proponents wish to make is that their ideas are clearly scientific. They're not religious ideas, therefore they should be taught in the science classroom. And of course, it's this which has led to some high-profile court cases in the States, including the Dover trial a few months ago. Now, I have to say, I'm very critical of those suggestions, and because I'm going to give you the Reader's Digest version, it may sound too critical, but I just want to speed on, and we want to leave plenty of time for questions, so do come back to me in question time if you feel I'm being unfair. But I think, let's just think about the first claim. I think that the real problem is that intelligent design doesn't really display the characteristics of what we understand to be a scientific theory. Now, the purpose of scientific theories in biology is to explain the relationships between all those components of the natural order, or the created order as I would call it, which make up living matter. And a further important criterion of biological explanations in science is that they be testable. There must be empirical evidence that can count for or against a theory, otherwise it simply remains vacuous. It remains in the domain of philosophy. So a successful theory will lead to a research program which will aim to establish its truth status. But I would suggest that intelligent design actually fails on both counts. Because firstly, simply saying that something is designed in biology doesn't really lead to any increase in understanding of the relationships between the various material components that comprise living matter. It doesn't really advance us, it doesn't take us any further than we were before. And second, labelling a biological entity as design doesn't lead to any experimental program that could be utilised to test the hypothesis. And I think it's that fact, actually, which explains the great lack of scientific papers coming out of the intelligent design movement. They're simply not contributing to the scientific corpus of peer-reviewed publications. Now, there are some claims about that, and I've looked at those claims, but really they're not actually, I would say, supporting their central claims. We can come back to that if you like. Okay, problem 2 comes from the suggestion that it's possible to define certain entities in biology as irreducibly complex in a meaningful fashion. And I would suggest that really just isn't possible, because all living matter is composed of thousands of components, all of which need to work together in a coordinated fashion to produce those properties that we associate with life. And so all the biological subsystems that maintain cell growth and division, including all the biochemical pathways that we study in the lab, without any exception at all, they're all extremely complex. And I could easily argue that all of them fall within the ID criteria used to identify an irreducibly complex system, since in each and every case, the subsystem only functions properly, providing all the components are in place in the first place. And that is why life works. That's how the whole thing hangs together. So I think sort of what we have in intelligent design is what I've called there the fallacy of large numbers. As soon as you have a multi-component system, then the chances of it coming into being all at once as a fully functional system are, of course, remotely small. But of course, no biologist thinks that's how things actually work in practice. Evolution actually works incrementally. And it's for this reason that ID proponents are very often accused, and I think rightly so, for propounding the old God of the gaps argument, the same sort of argument that already the other speakers have reflected upon. Except, I think in this case, it might more accurately be called the designer of the gaps argument. And so, I think religious believers have often been tempted by this argument from personal incredulity. Well, I can't imagine how that happened, therefore the designer must have done it. But I think that's extremely weak theology indeed, because invariably what happens is that in the fullness of time, the gap in scientific knowledge closes, the designer disappears, and the history of science is full of such examples. And that brings us then to the third and final problem, I think, which is that I've noticed that ID proponents tend to use the word naturalism in a manner which is very different from the normal understanding of that word. I'm so happy that a philosopher, a professional philosopher, has just walked into the room and sat down at the front, and so he can check up on this, that we've got our facts right. But if you go to a dictionary, and you'll find there, and you look up the word naturalism, you'll find it there defined in its philosophical sense. Oxford Dictionary must be right. Naturalism is a view of the world that excludes the supernatural or spiritual. But if you go into the writings of the intelligent design authors, such as Philip Johnson, you have many statements like this. I put up a couple. Phil Johnson says, and I quote, "It is conceivable that God for some reason did all the creating by apparently naturalistic processes. Naturalistic substitutes, like the blind watchmaker mechanism, are inadequate and contrary to the evidence. And theistic evolution can more accurately be described as theistic naturalism." But according to the dictionary understanding of naturalism, a term like theistic naturalism is an oxymoron. It's a contradiction in terms. It's like calling someone a fascist communist. You just can't do that. You've either got to accept the standard understanding of what naturalism means or not. And so Christian theism, the kind of theism to which Johnson's referring to in this passage, refers to the belief in a creator God who is the originator and sustainer of all that exists. And so God cannot possibly create by apparently naturalistic processes, for the simple reason that if there is a God who creates, then there are no naturalistic processes, because naturalism is false. And so unless you're really postmodern or very confused, you can't believe in both God and naturalism simultaneously. Now, just to point out that I'm not just picking on one of the authors of this point of view. But here's a very recent book from Bill Dembski. It's called The Design Revolution. Bill Dembski is one of the major proponents of intelligent design, where he says in this book there has to be a reliable way to distinguish between events or objects whose emergence additionally requires the help of a designing intelligence. The whole point of the design inference is to draw such a distinction between natural and intelligent causes. And so ID proponents envisage a biological world largely explained by naturalistic mechanisms, and it's against this backcloth that design systems may be detected. Indeed, if there is no such backcloth, the rest of their arguments would make little sense. Since if the identification of designed entities is to be possible, then clearly a non-design naturalistic backcloth is essential, otherwise the detection of the so-called design components would be impossible. And so, theologically, I see intelligent design as profoundly deficient. ID promotes the idea of what I call here a two-tier intelligent design universe, partly ruled by natural forces and partly designed. Whereas the theism, which I hold to as a Christian, sees everything without exception as being completely dependent upon the personal God. And so in this view, all that exists without exception reflects God's overall intentions and purposes for the created order. Now, what I think is most fascinating of all, and I'm going to close at this point, is that if you go back in the history of science, where you find the term intelligent design in the 19th century, it's actually being applied to Darwinian natural selection. And so I thought I'd close by giving you this rather nice quote from one of those early Presbyterian proponents of Darwinian evolution of the 19th century, Princeton University, James McCosh, president of Princeton University for many years. And here he is in the 1880s using the language of intelligent design to defend Darwinian evolution. The natural origin of species is not inconsistent with intelligent design in nature or with the existence of a personal creator of the world. I've been defending evolution, but in so doing have given the proper account of it as a method of God's procedure, and find that when so understood it is in no way inconsistent with Scripture. My suggestion is we stick to the theologians of the 19th century. Thank you.
Thank you, Dennis. Well, that's plenty to think about. We've got 20 minutes or so for questions. So does anybody want to kick off? Yes.
Yeah, just wanted to...
Perhaps could you stand up? I think it does help.
Okay. Just wanted to refer to the, I guess, the poster boy of the ID movement, the bacterial flagellum. I've heard it said that there is within the simple irreducible complex assembly a functional syringe. Is that actually true? And would you hold that actually undermines their arguments fatally?
Right, so the question is about, in case people didn't hear, it's about whether the flagellum, to take that specific example, contains subcomponents, subroutines as it were, which have separate, they're like modules where they have a separate structure of their own which has independent function. The answer is correct. It's called the type 3 secretory system, and it's composed of about 10 different proteins which are used for quite a different function in other bacteria, and they're actually used for self-defense. So they're used to inject toxins into other bacteria. You know, bacteria also have internecine warfares of their own, and they like ways to defend each other. So they're using the type 3 secretory system to inject a toxin into another attacking bacteria. And that module has an independent life of its own. It will come under natural selection independently. Now, the difficulty in the evolution of bacteria is that unlike things that reproduce by sexual reproduction, bacteria do a lot of swapping of genes. They're like stamp swappers. You know, I've got a good trick, I'll swap it with yours. And so in a sense, Darwinian evolution somewhat breaks down in its traditional form in the bacterial world because there's been lateral transfer of genes, and there's very clear evidence for that. So it's actually much more difficult to put clear lineages in terms of evolutionary lineages in the bacterial world compared to, let's say, the animal world and plant world and so forth. So it's difficult to be sure that that type 3 secretory system was, as it were, a precursor of the bacterial flagellum, but certainly there is an entity which has an independent function of its own, and, you know, could easily have been one of the precursors. Many, many examples of that, of course, in evolutionary history. While we're thinking about that, there are some proteins. There's one famous enzyme which has 5 different functions in our own bodies, actually. And so you can easily see how more complex systems are built up. Blood clotting, which is one of the examples that Michael Behe gives in his book, Darwin's Black Box. Of course, that book was written before sequencing the human genome. All of the enzymes, the so-called famous factors, factor 8, the one that's lacking in haemophilia, all that sort of thing. Actually, these are all proteases as a class of enzyme that actually takes up no less than 2% actually of the human genome. And there are hundreds of different protease enzymes, and they're made by gene duplication. And so it's very easy to go back and see how the blood clotting process, in fact, you can go back to other organisms where they only use 2 proteases, for example. That's quite enough to get a simple blood clotting mechanism going. We've got far more than that. And proteases, simply the genes that encode proteases, have clearly come about through gene duplication followed by diversification. So there are many ways in building up complex systems in the evolutionary process, although in many cases we don't know the specific detailed trajectory through evolutionary history. That's pretty hard actually to work out in complete detail.
You have mentioned the idea of Simon Conway-Morris and convergence, and I agree with you that it's something very important and probably something which have a theological significance, it's really important on theological point of view. I want to know if we can consider this idea that necessity is much more important than chance, as you say. Is it acceptable for, I would say, classical neo-Darwinism, or perhaps we can say something with not fully Darwinian, something new, with developed by people like Christian de Duve, for example, in Vital Dust, or Simon Conway-Morris, or Michael Denton. Is it something new, or is it something for you acceptable by the orthodoxy of neo-Darwinian synthesis?
I think, to be honest, I think, for example, to take Michael Denton and some of his ideas, just to fill in that question. So Michael Denton has the idea, which is really a sort of Platonic idea, that protein structures have always existed in the mind of, I don't know if he says the mind of God or the mind of the universe, anyway, in a Platonic mind. That says, so proteins, the ultimate proteins, are there with a big P, so those are the real proteins, and these are, as it were, what we're seeing in the evolutionary history is an unfolding of the Platonic mind in terms of those structures which then come into being. Now, in a sense, I think one doesn't have to leave what I would call, the true path of Darwinian orthodoxy to actually end up in a not dissimilar position. I wouldn't go with Michael Denton as far as that myself. But on the other hand, it's very clear. I mean, if you take all the genome sequences that have been done so far, you can actually take 2/3 of those sequences and you can put all the protein folds, that's the bits of the protein structure that do interesting things in protein structures, you can put them into about 1,200, 1,400 families. Okay, that sounds a lot. When by families I mean closely related structures. Okay, so in other words, what that's saying is, you take pretty much all the known proteins of the world, you can classify them down to a very, very limited array of protein structures. Now that's very, very remarkable. When you think that, each protein contains 20 amino acids. And if you have 100 amino acids in an array randomly distributed, that's a huge possible number, a cosmologically large number of possible proteins. But the actual number of protein motifs that you get from the point of view of structure is a very, very limited number. So I don't think that we have to go necessarily in a strong Platonic direction. We can do if we want to. But I would simply say that is simply the empirical fact. That's what structural protein biochemists are showing to us every day. It's simply an observation that we have. Many of them structures being produced here just down the road by friends of mine. And every time you can take a structure and you can just fit it into one of these little slots. It's going to be very rare now, disappointingly probably for a protein biochemist, to come up with a totally novel structure. Those days are probably gone actually, because we've seen it before. We've seen it all before. So, in other words, that's where necessity, I think, has the upper hand, in the sense that there are only certain proteins that will do the job. You know, if you want an enzyme, it has to have a certain shape in order to fit the substrate, and so on and so on. So the whole of life is connected in that way. So I'm a little bit suspicious of introducing, if you like, mystical texts into the structure, you know, kind of vitalism or vitalistic type of things. I don't think you need those in order to be very impressed by the fact that necessity is a powerful force, as it were, in the created order. That would be my take.
Yeah, this is a. Should I stand up?
Yeah. Yes, that'd be helpful.
This is about the process of evolution. You're talking about then the emergence of species. You're saying that different species normally have different numbers of chromosomes. How exactly is it that a species can gain a chromosome or lose one without becoming kind of deficient in some way and dying out?
Right. Yes, I don't think chromosome duplication is not a normal mechanism of speciation except in plants, particularly in plants. So in the case of plants, it's actually taking two sets of chromosome from the mother, in this case Tragopogon, you remember those two plant species, and actually incorporating both of those and utilizing the genes from both. Now if you think about it, those two parental species are very closely related. They're both Tragopogon, you know, they actually look a bit similar, but they don't interbreed. They are biologically different species. So it's not as if you're taking a set of chromosomes from a plant and one from a kangaroo and you're trying to put those together, then you really would have a problem. But if you've got two closely related species, as happens in plants, then, then the process will work. In actual fact, of course, you get the duplication of a number of genes through that process. Sorry. Better have the next question while I cough. Sorry.
Yes, any more? Yeah, just to give you a bit more breathing space. Talking about different organisms and combining them. Of course, that's a very hot topic at the moment, isn't it? With the government's decision about keeping different organisms and combining them. Which also leads me to say, those of you who are in Cambridge, there will be a debate on that between Sir Brian Heap and the US presidential advisor, Bill Hurlbut, on the issue of that sort of issue, stem cells.
Yes.
And so on. But do you want to say a word about that?
Oh, about making chimeras.
Yes.
This is an ethical question.
It is, yes.
Oh, ethics.
And then we'll go to the philosophy.
Thought we were going to manage to get out of ethics. Okay. Well, just a little more background. So, this is because certain scientists would like to make stem cells, and particularly to generate stem cells from patients who have Alzheimer's or Parkinson's disease, in order to track the development of those cells during the first few days of cell division. Okay, so we're not talking about chimeras between a rabbit and a human that you would want to actually have any kind of reproduction, which is illegal anyway, certainly in this country. So the idea is, because there's a great shortage of human eggs, the idea is to take the eggs from a rabbit or the eggs from, I think they're going to use cows, what else were they going to use? Anyway, whatever other animal you want to use. And what you do is you basically take out the nucleus. So the only bit of DNA left in that, let's say there's a rabbit nucleus, there's a rabbit egg. So if you take out the nucleus, the only bits of DNA, tiny bits of DNA, will be left inside are those in the mitochondria. So less than 0.1% actually. And so then you would pseudo-fertilize that rabbit egg with the DNA from, let's say, a skin cell from a patient, in order to enable the fusion. Pseudo-fertilization is not real fertilization, but it would then allow the egg to start dividing and to develop into a very, very early embryo, which would be 99.9 something % human. And that would enable you to track the development of that DNA information from your patient and see if there was anything abnormal going on there. And it's not that you can't do it with human eggs, it's just obviously the supply of human eggs is extremely limited compared to the supply of rabbit eggs for obvious reasons. So that's what the ethical controversy at the moment is about. And so one group of people saying, well, there's nothing wrong with that, because they're not going to be implanted, that's illegal anyway. They would only be grown in the lab for 14 days, enough to look at very, very early development. And then you've got other people saying, well, you know, this, although the DNA came from a human, and it somehow is being mixed, albeit at a very, very small percentage of rabbit DNA, in some way this is unethical. I happen not to have any problem with it at all, actually, but I'm sure there are people here who do have a problem with it. So this is where we could have an interesting ethical discussion. But
Thank you.
I was just going to say thank you very much. You seem to have crushed the creationism being taught in schools in America argument to smithereens. Why don't you just let them know in the US and then we'll be finished with it?
Well, I would say that, because this does raise the issue which does come up quite a bit of the time, in this country, let's keep to this country I think for the moment, but as to whether things like intelligent design should be taught in the science classroom. My own view would be that that would not be appropriate. And the reason for that is simply that intelligent design does not play any role at all in the biological scientific research community. And as I mentioned earlier, there are virtually no publications coming out of that way of looking at things. And it seems to me immoral, actually, and unethical to teach to school children something as if it was a debate going on in the scientific community, when actually it's not. Now, if there are real debates going on in Darwinian evolution, there are real debates going on about speciation, exactly how that happens, the mechanisms. Those are real debates. They should be taught, I think, because there is diversity of opinion within the Darwinian fold. But I think to teach to school children something which is not really part of orthodox science in any shape or form, I think is just a misuse of education, actually, because I don't think one should do that. However, having said that, let me put a right on it. I do think that it can be discussed in a religious education class, in philosophy class and so on, because it is an active issue in this whole area. So I'm only making that point about the science classroom, that's the point. And it's interesting, the Dover trial came out very clearly, and the judge, I think, had some very sensible things to say, actually, if you read the transcript, clearly saying, actually, this is a religious, philosophical idea. It is not a scientific idea. And that came across very clearly, actually, in the Dover trial, which I think was interesting. So.
Should we take one last question at the back?
When we want to discuss about life, we start the discussion about proteins. It's clear why is this, but the question is what about proteins? Because proteins is many macromolecules, and molecules are atoms, and atoms and molecules are not very intelligent. They are not able to do many things. So if we're looking from physics to proteins, is relevant or not the discussion about the origin of life? Why physics and how physics can change the terms of discussion, referring to evolution, for example? Because physics are not very present very often in the discussion about the origin of life, and I think it's a wrong point here.
Yeah. No, actually, I mean, of course, the whole origin of life discussion is an extremely interesting one. It's one which in this country is very difficult to get funding for, because the general UK government research attitude is, leave it to the Americans, they've got lots of money, they'll sort it out, basically. So it's actually a hard topic to get funding for. And the reason is, of course, that it's a really, really tough one. And it's interesting that actually physicists are very involved in this discussion. I have friends with a physics background, and one of them is actually taught in this course, Lou, who is working in a field very close to origin of life type of discussion. So I think what you see in origin of life research is you have mathematicians, you have physicists, you have chemists, especially you have biochemists, you have information theorists, all kind of working in that area. And I think it's a fascinating opportunity for interdisciplinary engagement. And actually there are centers in the States, where deliberately they have brought together a collection of people with these kind of disciplinary backgrounds. So it is a fascinating area. It's a tough area because obviously, you know, there's a lot of speculation there, and even if we can reproduce, which is the dream, you know, to sort of generate life in the lab, starting from first principles, as it were, from basic chemicals and so on. If we can do that, it doesn't mean to say that's how it happened at the beginning. It would be a significant breakthrough. Of course, there is a huge literature, as you know, in this area, and there are some very significant findings. I mean, many people still think that the so-called RNA world, of course, it's a chicken and egg, you see, you know, this is the whole discussion, is which came first. Proteins clearly can't really encode information in a way to pass on to RNA or some molecule like that. And so RNA has been suggested as the first sort of information-containing molecule. And I think the interesting thing about RNA is one of its problems is it's unstable, but it's much more stable at low temperatures, and it's very stable at high pressure, interestingly. There's an interesting research going on there about the properties of RNA at very high pressures. The point about RNA is it can function as an enzyme and as an information-encoding molecule. And so, in fact, if you take all the steps in protein biosynthesis, you can reproduce, which are catalyzed by a series of enzymes. There are now RNA molecules, they've been made artificially, RNA molecules that will catalyze each one of those steps. Now they do it very badly compared to proteins, but they do it. They have enzymatic functions and so forth. So that kind of work, I think, does give us some really interesting understanding, insights into the way in which first information-containing molecules may come about. Because if you have information-containing molecules that also can actually have enzymatic functions, then obviously the chicken and egg problem looks a little bit less intractable. Now, it's still very speculative, and it's a difficult and challenging area. And I would just say that it seems to me a great pity when religious people kind of look on that. This is a classic God of the gaps argument. I'm not suggesting that you are suggesting that in any way, but I just want to underline this point. But sometimes religious people...
does have effects in the theory of evolution or intelligent design, these results.
Yes.
It's referring to this part of under the structure of the protein. If there's results from physics about the structure of macromolecules, can have effects in the evolution theory or intelligent design theory or Christian theories or things like that.
Yes, I mean, my personal view would be our ignorance about the origin of life has no theological implications at all. Okay, that would be my position. It's simply we're very ignorant about that particular stage. It's as I say, it's a tough area to work on, obviously, because life was already around, certainly by 3.5 billion years ago. It's very hard to work on things, 3.5 billion years ago. We have our geologists here, but if you're thinking about the origin of life, that is tough. Now, and I think the intelligent design people obviously enjoy that particular gap in our knowledge, because then it raises issues of where does the information come from and so on. And they would like to put the designer particularly in that gap in our current knowledge. I would say again, theologically and philosophically, I think that's a very dangerous thing to do. Because if you just think over the past 50 years, which is a very short time in the history of science, it's amazing how our understanding of the origin of life is much greater than it was. It's still very limited. But I think we have to be very careful before popping our designer into these particular gaps in our knowledge. And there are also ways, while we're on this topic, I mean, for example, the transfer RNA, sorry, it's getting a little bit technical here, but there are transfer RNA. There's a transfer RNA for every single amino acid, which is involved in bringing the amino acid in order to do the protein synthesis and to get the amino acids in the right order. It's a very interesting work done. So transfer RNAs have another end where they bind to particular amino acids. So they have to bind to an amino acid, then they have a codon, anticodon, that plugs into the messenger RNA, and they bring those two together. That's how you get the specific sequence of the protein being built up. Turns out, that it's possible that actually those transfer RNAs were selected by the amino acid which they bind to. So there is a way of amino acids actually talking to transfer RNA those are the ones that got selected in order to do that particular job. And so you get information being built into the system by the fact that certain transfer RNAs have another end which bind to certain amino acids. So there's some very interesting work going on, and I won't go on about it, because I know the chairman's looking...
Because
yeah,
he's about to stop.
Yeah.
Actually, just one comment on the geological thing. It's a fascinating point that almost as soon as it became possible for life to exist on Earth, it did. We've got evidence of it. Actually, back 3.8 billion years. Anyway, thank you very much, Dennis. And don't forget to fill these in. We're going to have a half-hour tea break now. We'll start again at 4 o'clock with Alistair McGrath, who's just arrived.